Emily Harper sat trembling at her small art stand, her fragile frame dwarfed by the bustling city around her. A skeptic nearby scoffed at her paintings, his dismissive sneer cutting deeper than the chemo ever could. But then, out of nowhere, Keanu Reeves stepped up. Quiet, unassuming, a legend, in a worn leather jacket, and what happened next would leave the crowd speechless, rewriting her future in ways no one saw coming. Before we unravel this heart-stopping story, drop a comment below with where you're watching from. If you're hooked on tales like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we've got another unforgettable story waiting for you. Emily Harper sat on the crinkled hospital bed, her hands clenched into tight fists on her lap. The room was sterile, the air thick with the sharp sting of antiseptic and the faint, relentless beeping of machines from down the hall. She was 19, but the past year had aged her beyond that. Cancer did that to a person. Across from her, Dr. Gwynn adjusted his glasses, his face a practiced mask of calm. Emily knew that look. She'd seen it too many times over the last 12 months. The kind of expression doctors wore when they were about to drop a bomb and pretend it was just another Tuesday. "The treatment's working, Emily," he said, his voice steady but laced with a cautious edge. "We're seeing progress, but you'll need at least 2 more rounds of chemo to keep it that way." Emily nodded. She was used to the routine by now. The nausea that twisted her stomach into knots, the exhaustion that sank into her bones, the way her hair had fallen out in clumps until she'd shaved it all off. She could handle that. She'd been handling it. But then Dr. Gwynn cleared his throat and the air shifted. "Here's the thing," he said, hesitating just long enough to make her brace herself. "Your family's insurance won't cover the next round. The out-of-pocket costs, they're going to be substantial." Beside her, Emily's mom let out a shaky breath, a sound so small, yet so heavy it filled the room. Emily didn't need to look at her to know her mom's eyes were brimming with tears, her hands probably twisting the hem of her sweater like she always did when she was scared. Substantial. That word hung there, a guillotine waiting to drop. Emily's family wasn't rich. They weren't even comfortable anymore, not after a year of medical bills had drained their savings dry. The last round of chemo had pushed them to the edge, forcing her dad to pick up extra shifts at the warehouse and her mom to skip meals so Emily wouldn't notice how tight things had gotten. And now, this. 2 more rounds. Emily's chest tightened, not from the cancer this time, but from something worse. Fear. Not of dying, but of watching her parents lose everything trying to keep her alive. The drive home was silent. Her mom gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, her jaw set like she was holding back a scream. Her dad, sitting shotgun, stared out the window, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "We'll figure it out, Em. Everything's gonna be okay." But Emily heard the lie in it, the crack in his tone that said he didn't believe it any more than she did. That night she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding against her ribs. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let her parents drown in debt because of her. She refused to be the reason they lost the house, the reason they stopped sleeping, the reason they looked at each other like strangers now, instead of the team they'd always been. And that's when it hit her. Art. Painting had always been her escape, her lifeline through the endless hospital visits, and the nights she couldn't sleep from the pain. She'd been doodling since she was a kid, filling sketchbooks with landscapes and dreams, and over the years it had turned into something real. Something people used to compliment before the cancer took over her life. What if she could sell her paintings? What if she could create something worth enough to pay for the chemo herself? It wasn't a handout. It wasn't charity. It was her fighting back, taking control of the one thing she still had left. By morning, Emily had made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait for a miracle. She was going to make one. She told her mom over breakfast, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm going to set up an art stand downtown, sell my paintings, raise the money myself." Her mom's eyes widened, a mix of pride and worry flickering across her face. "Are you sure, honey? You're already so tired." Emily nodded. "I have to do this." Her mom didn't argue. She just hugged her tight and quick, then promised to help set it up. But not everyone was on board. Mia showed up later that day, her old friend from middle school who'd stuck by her through the diagnosis but hadn't been around as much lately. Emily hadn't expected her to react the way she did. "You're kidding, right?" Mia said, her voice sharp as she paced Emily's cramped bedroom. "An art stand? Emily, you're sick. You can barely stand for an hour and you think people are going to buy paintings from some random girl on the street? This is crazy. You're gonna kill yourself trying. Emily's stomach twisted, Mia's words slicing deeper than she'd expected. I'm not asking for your permission, she shot back, her voice rising. I'm doing this for me, for my family. Mia stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing. You're delusional. No one's gonna care, Em. You're just gonna waste what little energy you've got left. The air between them crackled with tension, years of friendship buckling under the weight of those words. Emily's hands clenched into fists again, her nails digging into her palms. If you don't believe in me, then leave, she said, her voice low but firm. Mia stared at her, then shook her head and stormed out, the door slamming behind her. Emily stood there, alone, her resolve hardening. She didn't need Mia. She didn't need anyone. She had her paint, her will, and a chance to fight. Tomorrow, she'd start. Tomorrow, she'd prove them all wrong. Emily Harper set up her art stand on a busy downtown sidewalk the next morning, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged her paintings on the small wooden table. She had spent the past week pouring every ounce of energy into her work. Canvases filled with bold strokes of orange and soft blues, scenes of sprawling deserts and quiet cityscapes that felt like pieces of her soul laid bare. Her mom had helped her carry everything out, giving her a quick squeeze on the shoulder before heading off to work. You've got this, Em, she'd said, her voice thick with hope. Emily clung to that as she settled onto a folding stool, a handwritten sign taped to the table. Original art funding my cancer treatment. This was it, her shot to fight back. The first few hours crawled by. People streamed past, a blur of suits and backpacks, tourists snapping photos, locals glued to their phones. Some glanced her way, their eyes flicking over the paintings before moving on. Others didn't even slow down. Emily forced a smile, nodding at anyone who lingered, but the table stayed empty of cash. Hope was a fragile thing, and she could feel it fraying with every indifferent step that echoed around her. By noon, the heat pressed down, making her dizzy. She reached for her water bottle, her hands shaky from fatigue. The chemo had left her weak, her body a traitor she couldn't trust, but she wouldn't give up. Not yet. Then a man stopped. He was middle-aged, wearing a worn leather jacket and a crooked grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. He picked up a painting, a desert sky streaked with gold, and studied it for a moment. Nice work, he said, his voice smooth. How much? Emily swallowed, her heart jumping. $80. He nodded, pulling out a wad of cash and handing her 420s. She barely breathed as she packed the painting into a paper bag, her first sale buzzing through her like electricity. Thank you, she said, her voice cracking with relief. He tipped an imaginary hat and walked off, blending into the crowd. For a moment, she let herself believe it. Maybe this could work. That night, she showed the money to her dad, grinning as she spread the bills on the kitchen table. He smiled back, a rare flicker of light in his tired eyes, but then he picked up one of the 20s, holding it to the light. His face fell. And this isn't real. Her stomach dropped. She snatched the bill, squinting at it. The edges were off, the ink too blurry. Fake, all of them. The air sucked out of the room as her dad ran a hand through his thinning hair. I'm sorry, kiddo, he muttered. Emily stared at the counterfeit money, her victory crumbling into dust. She'd been scammed, and worse, she'd let herself hope. The betrayal stung deeper than the cancer ever had. The next day she was back at the stand, determined not to let one jerk stop her. She'd sold nothing by mid-afternoon when the sky darkened without warning. A crack of thunder split the air and rain poured down in sheets. Emily scrambled to cover her paintings, but the wind yanked the tarp from her hands. Water soaked through the canvases, colors bleeding into muddy streaks. She dropped to her knees, clutching the ruined artwork, her breath hitching as rain mixed with tears. 3 paintings. Hours of work, pieces of her fight, gone. She sat there, drenched and shivering, the weight of failure crushing her. Maybe Mia was right. Maybe no one cared. When she got home, soaked to the bone, she overheard her parents in the kitchen. Their voices were low at first, then sharp, cutting through the walls. We can't keep doing this, Lisa, her dad said, his tone jagged with frustration. The bills are piling up. We need to sell the house. Her mom's reply was fierce. And go where, Tom? This is our home. She's fighting, and you want to give up everything? Emily froze in the hallway, her wet clothes dripping onto the floor. I'm not giving up, her dad snapped. I'm trying to save her. We're out of options. The argument spiraled, their words a tangle of desperation and blame. Emily pressed a hand to her chest, her heart pounding. They were breaking apart because of her, because she couldn't fix this fast enough. She slipped into her room, shutting the door on their voices, and sank onto her bed. The scammer's fake money sat on her nightstand, mocking her. The ruined paintings were still in a soggy pile by the door, a reminder of how fragile her plan was. Her body ached, the chemo's after effects gnawing at her, but the real pain was deeper: guilt, fear, the suffocating pressure of being the reason her family was cracking. She thought of Mia's words, "You're going to kill yourself trying." They echoed in her head, louder now, taunting her. Had she been delusional to think this would work? She curled into a ball, hugging her knees, and let the tears come. But even as they fell, something stubborn flickered inside her, a spark she couldn't snuff out. She wasn't done. Not yet. The next morning, Emily dragged herself back to the stand. She had fewer paintings now, but she set them up anyway, her jaw tight with defiance. She wouldn't let the scammer win, she wouldn't let the rain win, and she sure as hell wouldn't let her parents lose their home because she'd given up. The crowd moved past, same as always, indifferent, distracted. Her hands gripped the table's edge, steadying her against the dizziness creeping in. She didn't know how she'd keep going, but she knew one thing: she had to, for her family, for herself, and maybe, just maybe, someone out there would see her fight and stop. Emily Harper sat at her art stand, her body aching from the chemo's relentless grip. It was her 4th day on the downtown sidewalk, and the spark of defiance that had pushed her back out here was flickering. She'd sold nothing since the scammer and the rain had gutted her efforts. Her remaining paintings, fewer now but still alive with color and heart, sat untouched on the wooden table. Her handwritten sign, "Original Art, Funding My Cancer Treatment," flapping slightly in the breeze. The crowd moved past, a blur of apathy. She gripped her water bottle, fighting the dizziness creeping in, and forced herself to sit straighter. She wouldn't quit. Not yet. Then someone stopped. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a weathered leather jacket and a faded black cap pulled low over his face. His hair, long and dark, was tied back loosely, and he carried himself with a quiet stillness that felt out of place amid the city's chaos. He didn't rush by or glance at his phone like the others. Instead, he stood there, hands in his pockets, studying her paintings with an intensity that made Emily shift uncomfortably. She'd seen all kinds of people, tourists, skeptics, pitying strangers, but something about this guy was different. "See anything you like?" she asked, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Depends," he said, his tone low and gravelly, almost familiar. "What's the story behind these?" Emily hesitated. Most people asked about prices, not stories. She glanced at him again, catching a glimpse of sharp, steady eyes under the cap's brim, eyes that seemed to see more than she was used to showing. "I paint because I have to," she said, keeping it simple at first. He didn't interrupt, just waited, so she went on. "I've got cancer. The treatments are expensive and my family can't afford them. Every brushstroke, every sale, it's me fighting to stay alive." He nodded, like he'd heard hard stories before and knew better than to offer empty sympathy. Then he reached for a painting, a black and white piece she'd poured weeks into, a lone traveler standing under a vast, endless sky. He held it up, turning it slightly as if weighing its worth. "I'll take this one," he said. Emily's heart skipped. "It's $200, she replied, brushing a hand through her short, cropped hair. He didn't reach for cash. Instead, he pulled a checkbook from his jacket, an odd, old-school move that threw her off. She watched as he scribbled something, his movements deliberate, then tore the check free and handed it to her. Emily took it, her fingers barely gripping the paper, and froze. Her breath caught as her eyes locked on the amount, $50,000. Not 200, 50,000. Her vision blurred at the edges, her hands trembling so hard the check nearly slipped. This can't be right," she whispered, her voice breaking. He pushed his cap back, revealing his face fully, those piercing eyes, that quiet intensity, and her heart stopped. Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves. The guy from her dad's favorite movies, the Hollywood legend who didn't just act tough but lived it, standing here at her stand, changing her life with a single piece of paper. Before she could speak, the air shifted. A group of teens nearby, loud, rowdy hoodies pulled up. Stopped dead, staring at Keanu. One of them, a wiry kid with a smirk, stepped forward. "Yo, that's not him," he said, voice dripping with doubt. "Some poser pretending to be Keanu Reeves? What's this, a scam?" Another kid laughed, pulling out his phone. "Yeah, man, he's ripping her off or something." The group closed in, their taunts growing sharper. Emily's shock snapped into anger. She stood, legs shaky but firm, and glared at them. "He's real, okay? Back off. He's not scamming anyone." Keanu stayed calm, hands still in his pockets, but his eyes flicked to her with a faint nod, like he appreciated her stepping up. The wiry kid scoffed. "Prove it, then." Emily clutched the check tighter, her voice rising. "He just bought my painting. He's helping me, not hurting me. Leave him alone." The teens hesitated, thrown by her fire, then muttered and backed off, though one kept filming. Keanu smirked faintly, leaning in just enough for her to hear, "You're tougher than you look, kid." She blinked, caught off guard, but something clicked between them, a quiet bond forged in that messy moment. The crowd was stirring now, whispers rippling outward. Phones came out, pictures snapped. "Is that Keanu Reeves?" someone gasped. "He's buying her art," another voice shouted. Emily barely registered it, still reeling from the check in her hand. But trouble wasn't done brewing. By evening, a local journalist, a guy named Derek Holt, known for stirring drama, posted online, "Keanu Reeves spotted at teen's art stand. Heartwarming tale or staged publicity stunt?" The article hit fast, accusing Emily of faking her story for attention, claiming Keanu's generosity was too perfect to be real. Comments flooded in, some supportive, others vicious. "She's lying. It's a con." Emily's phone buzzed with the notification as she sat at home, her stomach twisting. She'd gone from nothing to a lifeline to a target in hours. She looked at the check again, Keanu's neat handwriting staring back at her. $50,000, enough to cover her chemo, maybe more, but now, with the world watching and doubting, it felt heavier than ever. She didn't know how to fight this, didn't know if people would believe her. All she knew was that Keanu had seen her, really seen her, and given her a chance, and somehow that made her want to keep going, no matter what came next. Emily Harper's art stand transformed overnight. By morning, the downtown sidewalk was packed, people crowding around her small wooden table, hands reaching for her paintings like they were rare treasures. Keanu Reeves' $50,000 check had ignited a firestorm. Word spread fast after the teens' confrontation and the viral photos, amplified by Derek Holt's snarky article. But while Holt's skepticism had painted her as a fraud to some, it backfired with others. Strangers showed up, drawn by the story of a dying girl and a Hollywood legend. "I'll take this one," a woman in a red coat shouted, snagging a cityscape painting. "How much for that desert scene?" a guy in a baseball cap asked, waving cash. Emily barely kept up, her hands shaking as she packed canvases and took money. By noon, every painting was gone. Thousands of dollars in her pocket, more than she'd dreamed possible. She should have felt triumphant, but the frenzy left her dizzy. Her body was screaming, chemo fatigue clawing at her muscles, her breath short from standing too long. Still, she forced a smile, nodding at the last buyer as the crowd thinned. For the first time, the chemo seemed within reach. She could save her parents' house, lift the weight crushing them. But the high didn't last. 2 days later, a letter arrived. Official, typed, cold. Victor Kane, a local artist with a small following, was suing her. He claimed her black and white painting, the one Keanu bought, copied a piece he'd shown at a gallery years ago. "Cease all sales and surrender profits," the letter demanded, "or face court." Emily stared at it, her stomach sinking. She'd never seen Kane's work. Her painting came from her own sleepless nights, her own fight, but the accusation hit hard, another blow when she'd just started to stand. That night, she sat in her room, the letter crumpled in her lap. Her phone buzzed with hate from Holt's followers. Thief, fake, scammer. She'd gone from invisible to a target in a week. Tears stung her eyes, but before they fell, a knock came at her door. It was Mia. Her old friend stood there, hands stuffed in her hoodie, eyes down. "I was wrong," Mia said, her voice small. "I shouldn't have doubted you. I saw the news, the lawsuit. I'm here to help." Emily blinked, anger and relief crashing together. "You called me delusional," she snapped. Mia winced. "I know. I was scared for you. But you're doing something incredible, Em. Let me fix this with you." Emily hesitated, then nodded. She couldn't do this alone, not anymore. Thea dove in, researching Kane's claim, digging up old exhibition records. She found his painting online. A vague similarity in theme, but the style, the soul, was different. "This won't hold up," Mia said, fierce now. "We'll fight it." Emily clung to that, but the stress piled on. Then an envelope arrived. No return address, just a check for $10,000 and a note, "For legal fees, keep painting." Emily's breath hitched. Keanu. He was watching, helping from the shadows. She didn't know how he'd found her address, but it didn't matter. That money hired a lawyer, a sharp woman named Carla, who took the case with a glint in her eye. "Kane's got nothing," Carla said. "We'll bury him." The lawsuit dragged on, hearings eating up weeks. Emily sat in court, frail but upright, as Carla tore Kane's case apart, proving her work was original, born from her own pain, not his. Mia sat beside her, squeezing her hand when Kane glared from across the room. Online, the tide turned. Holt's followers quieted as supporters rallied. "She's real, she's a fighter." Emily dared to hope again. Then, the day before the verdict, her phone rang. It was Dr. Nguyen. "Emily, we need you in tomorrow," he said, his voice tight. "Your latest scans, the cancer's back, it's spreading faster this time." The words hit like a punch. She hung up, numb, and sank onto her bed. Relapsed. After everything, the sales, the fight, Keanu's check, she was losing ground. Her parents didn't know yet. She couldn't tell them, not when they'd just stopped arguing about the house. She stared at her paintbrushes on the desk, her lifeline, and felt them slipping away. She faced a choice. Keep painting, keep chasing this dream that had exploded beyond her control, or pour everything into treatment, maybe her last shot at survival. Her hands shook as she picked up a brush, then set it down. Art had saved her once, but could it now? Or was it stealing the time she had left? The next day, the judge ruled. "Case dismissed," he said, voice firm. "No evidence of plagiarism." Kane stormed out, defeated. Emily exhaled, a hollow victory. Mia hugged her, whispering, "You did it." Carla grinned, and the $50,000 from Keanu stayed hers, along with the sales, enough for Keanu, maybe more, but the win felt distant. That afternoon, she sat in Dr. Nguyen's office, staring at new scans, dark spots blooming like ink on her lung. "We can try aggressive treatment," he said. "It's risky, but it's a chance." Emily nodded, her mind spinning. She'd fought for her art, her family, her life. Now she had to choose how to fight again, paintbrush or hospital bed. And this time, she wasn't sure she could win. Emily Harper stood taller after the lawsuit, though her body still trembled from the cancer's grip. The judge's ruling had secured her future. Victor Kane's claim was dead, and the $50,000 from Keanu Reeves, plus her sales, stayed hers. She poured every dollar into treatment, walking into the hospital the next day with her head high. Dr. Nguyen's aggressive plan was brutal. Chemo hit harder, days blurred into nausea and fatigue. But Emily fought through it, fueled by the lifeline Keanu had thrown her. Weeks later, scans showed the dark spots shrinking. She'd won again against Kane, against the disease. By month's end, her final round was done, paid in full. The bills that once suffocated her family vanished, and her parents smiled at each other for the first time in a year. With strength returning, Emily turned back to her art. She'd survived, and now she wanted to build something lasting. She rented a small gallery downtown, using leftover funds to host her first exhibition. The night arrived fast. Walls lined with her paintings, bold colors and stark contrast telling her story. People filled the space. Buyers, supporters, even strangers moved by her fight. Mia stood by her, grinning, their friendship mended. Emily wore a simple dress, her hair a short, defiant buzz, and felt alive. Then the crowd parted, and there he was, Keanu Reeves, slipping in quietly, leather jacket and all. She froze as he approached, his steady eyes meeting hers. "Heard you were putting on a show," he said, that faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Had to see it." Emily stammered, I didn't think you'd come." He shrugged, glancing at her work. "You're worth it." Then his voice softened and he leaned closer. "I lost my sister to cancer years ago. She fought like you. When I saw you that day, I saw her. That's why I stopped." The words landed heavy, peeling back the mystery of his kindness. Emily's throat tightened, tears prickling. He hadn't just saved her. He'd honored a ghost through her. She nodded, swallowing hard, then turned to a covered canvas behind her. "I've got something for you." She pulled the cloth away, revealing the black and white painting, The Lone Traveler Under an Endless Sky, the first piece she'd ever sold. "It's yours," she said. "Not for money, for what you did. It's us now. Friendship, hope, all of it." Keanu stared at it, then at her, his expression softening in a way she hadn't seen before. "Thank you, Emily," he said, voice low but warm. He took it, and in that exchange something unspoken sealed their bond. The exhibition sold out, commissions flooded her inbox, and Emily's name spread. The girl who painted her way through cancer. She survived not just the disease, but the doubt, the despair. Months later, she stood in her new studio, a brush in hand, starting a fresh canvas. That first painting hung in Keanu's home now, a quiet testament to their moment. Emily smiled, knowing she'd become more than a survivor, an artist, a voice, inspiring others to fight their own battles. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It was a light for anyone lost in the dark, proof that even the smallest stroke could change everything. Emily's journey teaches us that resilience isn't just surviving, it's finding strength in the unexpected, like a stranger's kindness or a friend's return. It's about turning pain into purpose, proving that even in our darkest moments we can create light for ourselves and others. In life, this means embracing every small fight, knowing help might come from anywhere, and never underestimating our own grit. Thanks for joining us on this incredible ride. Your support means everything. Drop a comment below. What's your takeaway? Subscribe for more stories that inspire, because next time, it could be your turn to shine.